Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišák, and I work as the deputy head of the foreign desk at the Slovak Derby Pravda, which by the name means truth, and is not the Russian Pravda. When Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy issued a decree allowing Russia's Victory Day military parade to proceed, it was clear that there would be a strong reaction from the Kremlin. We knew there would be a response in terms of metal, as we always call it. A lot of metal flying through our skies and, of course, falling down on our heads. But it was really to the point and something very innovative. No one was expecting that, Ukrainian analyst Viktoria Vdovichenko told me. She is the joint program leader of the Future for Ukraine project at the Center for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge and holds a PhD in foreign policy and world history. Does she think that Zelenskyy and Putin will meet at the negotiation table? And should Europe talk to the Russian dictator? Listen to our conversation. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Coffee. You can find the link in the description of this episode. And now, on to the new debate. Victoria, there was a deal about the 3-day ceasefire announced by US President Donald Trump regarding May 9th. According to reports from the battlefield, it was hardly a real ceasefire. And almost immediately afterwards, Russia launched a massive attack against Ukraine, killing over 20 people just in Kyiv. Ukraine responded by attacking Moscow. From your perspective, what do these developments tell us about the current dynamics of the war?
As we are talking just right now, Russians made a ballistic attack on Proluki, which is the center of Ukraine. So just for the record, it's 19th of May today. There are 2 people who died. It's Chernihiv region and 21 who are wounded. And it's today, 10 days after, exactly 10 days after so-called, as you say, ceasefire. The prerequisite for that was that President of Ukraine, as you know, on the 6th of May, we will stop, let's say, our attacks on the refineries in order to make sure that the people asking through American President Donald Trump, the Ukrainian authorities and Ukrainian nations to this regard, some of the leaders, some of the so-called world leaders who were coming to the parade will continue conducting peacefully. The attacks on the 6th of May, they were on Ukraine, as you know, and there were some attacks at the center of Ukraine, eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine. The same as the 7th of May. And then, as we know, the parade went smoothly, and there was a very interesting strategic communication decree of the president of Ukraine allowing, I think it's important to mention even now in this discussion, allowing, that the Red Square is there, presenting the size of it, and then, of course, presenting the opportunity that we allow to have a parade. And I believe that explains to some extent why there was a very heavily attacked not only Kyiv, but the western part of Ukraine, and for the first time, Uzhhorod. For the sake of the conversation and for our listeners, we have to say that Uzhhorod is the most, let's say, geographically speaking, western city of Ukraine, being at the border both with Slovakia and Hungary to this respect. And never, I would like to underline never, it was either attacked or there were sirens prior than the beginning of May 2026. And that's why, even as we know, the new authorities of Hungary, so they were summoning the Russian Federation ambassador in Hungary to ask why the attack was on the Hungarian population, because we know there are Hungarian Ukrainians who are for long periods of time settling and living there. So these were some of the events that we say, unfortunately, are together with the attack on the capital of Ukraine, Kyiv, which was, I think, the hardest ever and was the most intensive in the last, 4.5 years, to be precisely, of the full-scale invasion, was the hardest attack ever with one of the highest ranks of the civilian casualties happening exactly at the beginning of May as a result of so-called, as you name it, the ceasefire, which is absolutely not. Whether it's referring to the IHL, because even on the southern parts of Ukraine, there were UN vehicles attacked by drones on purpose. And that's specifically, there was a very interesting Twitter from the UN authorities saying that they condemned the attack, but they never say from whom the attack was done and where. So very interesting implication on this case.
Does it somehow affect what's going on the battlefield?
I would be quoting for the first time Alexander Stubb, the Finnish president, who just at the Lena-Mari conference in Tallinn last week announced that indeed Ukraine achieved more territories than in the last period, and mostly now that we established the 20 till 40 kilometers of the kill zone, so literally stopping the Russian troops at the ground, but at the same time gaining the advantage. And gaining the advantage was 2 days ago the attack of drones deep down in Moscow, but also again on the critical infrastructure and on the refineries, because that's a very important understanding of how smart the attacks are, of course, in the terms of survival, in order to show that the advancement of Ukrainian, let's say, strategic posture will be there. So, yes, from the civilian point of view, May was one of the scariest one after January and February, when many of Kyiv people, but also in other cities, were freezing, literally speaking. But this one, I believe, in the Russian narrative, there was an idea again to provoke, let's say, migration flows or internal migration flows, which didn't happen. So it means that even the attacks were very heavily, and again, I have to say that they were one of the highest loss of civilians and the casualties, but it never provoked what it wanted in terms of these migration flow challenges and advancement. At the same time, Ukrainians proving that they know what the deep strikes and the middle strikes mean, and trying to focus on the attacks in order to make Russian economy vulnerable, especially taking into account that we are talking about not only shadow fleet operations that normally Andrei and you and I are talking about, but mostly about how much Russia is gaining, economically speaking, the advantage when the Hormuz Strait is closed and there are interest in the oil and gas, but primarily oil from Russia. So now, when at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, when the Russian oil was about $20 per barrel, now it's sometimes going from 120 till 140, depends, of course, on the peak days, dollar per barrel, which means that the Russian economy is still continuing to gain a lot of effect, despite even these, what we say, limitations from the United States that now that the US established, for some of oil and gas, oil in particular. What does it mean in terms of how Ukraine is positioning itself, especially taking into account that we were last week having this B9 plus Nordic countries forum, talking about, of course, security of the sea routes, but also land routes in not only communication, but mostly in the transporting and the safety for that, because logistically speaking, it's one of the key important elements. But also talking about the developments in the defense industries, and specifically taking into account that in many countries, your country also, there are priorities for especially defense SMEs, apart from large companies in other countries, to work closer with Ukraine, we say, technological advancement, and at the same time trying to prioritize, as President of Ukraine say, drone deal perspectives, not only with the United States that we were preparing already in some kind of the corpora, but also with other countries. Germany is one of them, especially after the Munich Security Conference presentation of first German/Ukrainian drone produced on German soil. UK, especially now that there are localized capabilities already in UK, and this is one of the advancement for 100 years partnership between UK and Ukraine. France is considering the same option, as well as Italy. Now we opened, or EU to this perspective, open EU Defense Innovation Hub almost 2 years ago in Kyiv. UK has opened Defense Innovation Hub, and other countries are looking to this perspective. So if I may potentially stop here and just to summarize that the internal dynamics, especially with the drone circulations, ballistic missiles attacks, as I was telling again and again, sometimes planned. Our intelligence service can inform us about, or sometimes not so much, because the attacks on the western cities and Kyiv capital, as well as all of the other cities, is constantly changing the dynamics. But from the external perspective or foreign policy never changed to the priority of Ukrainian authority to boost the presence of Ukraine in terms of interest in technological advancement. In this case, of course, defense is one of the top priorities for that, but also in understanding how we're going to work on with European integration. And for this specific purpose, should I don't know, name Euro-Atlantic integration, but mostly I believe it's working more closer with European NATO partners in this sense.
And you mentioned that Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelenskyy issued a decree allowing Russia's Victory Day military parade to proceed. While it was clear a humiliation for Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, was it wise from a tactical point of view? It was expected that Russia would react.
No. It was a very, as we say in strategic communication, a very strategic point. So literally you can't knock down that. Or it was a kind of a strategic knockdown, and it was absolutely transmitted in all of the media. In understanding that exactly the nuances of current geopolitical appetites of certain countries, but at the same time, the nuances of how US-Russia so-called strategic posture is changing, and why through American president, Ukrainian president was asked not to attack or anything. So I believe it was a very interesting, from historical even perspective, step. And all those manuals who are ever going to be published on the narratives and strategic communication, they will definitely use this example, because it's agile. It was really up to the point, and something very innovative. So no one was expecting that. And of course, this is why I was saying Ukrainian society or Ukrainian people knew they're going to be, what we say, a mirror response in terms of metal, as we always call it. A lot of metal going to our skies and, of course, dropping down on our heads. But either you advance further, adapt, reconsider being agile, or not. So you're not existing.
What you make out of such visits, like Prime Minister Fico visiting Moscow, and he will be probably the only one now because Orban is gone?
Andrei, I think it's not a question to me as a Ukrainian scholar to ask. I believe it's more to the Slovak society to decide, and to analyze such steps, or let's say such visits, in a political sense, because I can analyze only Ukrainian steps, and I believe it's fair. I can speculate a lot about why it's fair or not fair for Slovak authorities, but there are Slovak people who also observe, analyze, I hope make right decisions and summary. That's why we're talking even with you about that.
That's true. Victoria, according to military experts, Ukrainian strikes on Moscow were not just symbolic. They were operational, targeting military and industrial facilities, fuel infrastructure, and the Russian air defense system. But it also seems that people in Moscow are surprised that Ukraine is able to penetrate the missile defense rings around the city. As I said, Ukrainian strikes on Moscow were not just symbolic, but how important is this psychological dimension of the war?
Well, the cognitive warfare, as we say, more potentially like that, because psychological component is one of them in this case, is not only, I'm quoting NATO scientific report of 2025, or principal scientist of NATO, saying that the cognitive warfare is one of the key advancement to all of the countries, because you cannot see, but you can feel its influence, right? So that's why we have to mention that starting from March, there are some of the social media that have been shut down in Russian Federation, right? Social medias and internet, so I must say. So basically controlling the flows of the information and adjusting a specific flows of information. That's something that is incorporating current predominant words. Still, at the same time, I believe in this talk with you, it's very rational to put, some of the approaches of Western countries, or we say European countries, who issued more visas than in the all previous periods as of statistics of 2025, which means that business as usual sometimes is prevailing, as well as the interest as usual sometimes prevailing, not limiting, let's say, many of young scholars, young people to visit going abroad, despite the sanctions and all of that, which also means that a part of how the effect on the drone circulations over Moscow was recognized as something not possible at all. So now, of course, the Russian economy is deteriorating, and I will not be the one to put the figures here because the figures are very sometimes subjective, because there are different institutes who will put you different figures, and there are different political affiliations for that. But also those scholars, especially before in Russia Federation, now they're saying that it's one of the most devastating moments. The only, as I told you, channel of engine of Russian economy is still oil. That's why the priority of the attacks, I repeated that in our first part of communication, was on the refineries and some of what we say, not critical infrastructure, but specifically defense industries production, those who are basically killing or producing. And that was one of the key, let's say, shifts, which was always the priority on the strategical level and never, let's say, undermined. And that's why there is this now, what we say, information flow when it's limited, right? So, or specifically control. Now you give more of the subject to the reality, and for that, and then questioning also the Russian society whether their authorities are doing the right thing, And I believe that was, as you mentioned, it's psychological effect of such attacks, but not only, it produced actually more. So now, in terms of understanding if there are critical mass still in the Russian Federation who are supporting the Russian authorities, yes, there is. Is there still a critical mass who double or doubt that? I don't think we're still there. But that's what the cognitive warfare is doing sometimes, is changing the perspective of the reality, and to such an extent that people do not understand what's true and not true.
Victoria, after the attack on Kiev, you wrote, I saw it on your LinkedIn, Russia escalates. It is not interested in long-term peace. It cannot uphold even an agreed ceasefire. Brutally attacking civilians is what it does when it cannot prevail in anything else.
Mm-hmm.
And this is true. I very much agree with every word you wrote. But we are hearing growing voices in Europe arguing to some channels of communication, with Putin should remain open and we should talk to Putin. What would be your advice to EU leaders? Should they pursue such contacts? And if so, how?
Well, for the sake of the argument, and I believe it's true, diplomatically speaking or militarily speaking, there are always secure line of communication. They never stopped, right? So just for our listeners, it's how this world functions. But I do understand the prerequisite of your question, and saying that's what Ukrainian scholars are always telling. It's just the point that some of the communities and some of the political parties in particular, they would like publicly to establish what we say business as usual before, thinking not only about, and specifically why I was mentioning oil industry so much, because they relying on the export of oil and gas, especially after which we are coming to some kind of the energy crisis or very close to that, to some expectations, thinking that coming to business as usual as Russian Federation will be the only and potentially the only exclusive way out. And that's why it was one of the preconditions of US, right, to lift some of the restrictions in March and April 2026 on the request so-called of 10 countries, right, in the world, who were saying that they were very much relying on oil and gas from Russian Federation. The question is what to do, because I don't believe that the European leaders, despite all of our research papers, policy papers, scenarios, projections and everything, still make credit of the critical mindset shift that coming back to business as usual with Russian Federation is a no way to go for European countries to survive. And I'm exclusively saying European because it's not only EU, it's UK, Norway, even Switzerland, if we're talking about European continent, but also, for example, Balkan states, right, for this perspective. So interconnectedness in what we are living, of course, derives us into understanding that from one side, yes, the peace era is gone and we will be more, let's say, oriented towards the more conflictual spectrum of the things, but at the same time, that's what Russian Federation ideologically was trying to achieve, to disintegrate European countries. I will not say EU only, because the processes of protests that are happening and skyrocketing as we speak, also touching upon UK, for example. And so undermining the unity and solidarity for Ukraine is one of the credible things that Russian Federation is seeking eager to. And that's why you will not hear so much in the media about good news from Ukraine, and only the most devastating news will psychologically, or again cognitively, will change the perspective. Okay, why should we, and I'm just simplifying, why should we send money or let's say prioritize our budgets, even if we have some other budget cuts, to the Western aid, meaning to humanitarian defense or financial aid to Ukraine, then we have our own internal problems, right? And this narrative never went away since 2022, but even before. But now it's very much escalating. We've seen the cognitive and specifically the usage of the AI in this case was very much helpful. It's not still right now true in 2026, but in 2025, we were, our partner organizations were monitoring the generative AI and into the 5 questions of understanding why the solidarity of Ukraine should prevail. The second one, why NATO-Ukraine talks are the one possible. Mobilization is one of the internal challenge and sensitive factor. Especially those, which is number 4, Ukrainians being abroad, especially on the male population side, sometimes being abroad and everything. And there was also question number 5, but just I'll give you these 4. And primarily generative AI, which means, as we know, ChatGPT, Gemini, even Claude, they were using Russian sources in order to generate the responses, or let's say more propagandistic sources, because that's what the people are using, especially the young generation are using, but not the young generation, all of us are using generative AI to some answers of the questions, and it puts you an alarm and doubt in your mindset, again, cognitive, right? Maybe it's true, right? So the blurring between true and false is subtitle. If you don't study history so much, and the good history books, I must say, because there are specific historic books that will challenge your truthness. So then you will definitely not know what to do. Well, I want to say that in this case, yes, some of the countries and even some of the communities were challenging their authorities to come into the business as usual with Russian Federation, because it's more flows in tourism in some of the countries, specifically in the Southern Europe, in some of the communities. It's more of a focus on more protection, so-called protection, of oil and gas, so energy sources. And it's more, let's say, more stable precondition for the ceasefire, right? So because it opens up a lot of, let's say, windows, right, for the things. Everyone is waiting for the ceasefire, but no one knows what to do after the moment it comes into, how not to make it fragile, how to make it a true ceasefire, which I can say is all of the Ukrainians, we want that. And definitely the end of the war, we want that. But on which conditions, under which requisites, that's something I believe it's under discussion. That's why these narratives are much more attacking what we say European societies than Ukrainians.
Putin said that he would prefer to talk to Gerhard Schroeder. Perhaps Putin is senile and thinks Schroeder is still...
And then Merkel as well.
And then Merkel as well. And so he might think that those guys are still in charge. But of course, I think he was just mocking Europe. But theoretically, if we had to choose an European to talk to Putin, who would it be?
It's a very tough discussion because I heard some of the candidacy of Alexander Stubb, which I already mentioned before, of Kaja Kallas, and there are several others. And it's hard for me, even predict how it will go, because who it will be is one thing, it's my wishful thinking, but who it will in reality will be, it's a completely different thing. And it's a kind of a combo, and there was Mario Draghi, by the way, also nominated or mentioned somehow. The names might change. that's for sure, because none from the Russian side, which is something of the prerequisite, right, mentioned that Russia will agree to such a common denominator, right? So someone who will negotiate on behalf of European countries in this case. And that's why, for me, I believe, Andrei, it's not the way I wish it to be, but it's the way how do things going to go. And it's not a foresight exercise for us, to do that. But I believe all of the candidacy that I mentioned have their strong, let's say, prerequisite in their own spectrum. I don't believe that all of them will be accepted the Russian side for obvious reasons, and the narratives and the previous capacities in particular, they were applicable.
And finally, Victoria, one last thing, just briefly. President Zelenskyy said that he is ready to meet Putin. Do you foresee such negotiations taking place this year?
Andrei, at some point, these negotiations will happen. I don't know whether they will happen this year. So, as I told you, we will be preparing to sit on the negotiations. We are still in the pre-negotiation phase. Even in the media, you can hear a lot that the negotiation rounds are happening. It's not true, because we are in the pre-negotiation phase. No one agreed on the terms of each other. So that's what we call pre-negotiation phase. But at some point, all of the wars are ending up with sitting on this table, so-called. And, well, in this case, for sure, the presidents will be representing each of their respective sides. If speculating, is going to happen by the end of this year, with which portfolio, who will be on each of the side, that will be of key importance. And that's why when we are speaking with you, Putin is meeting with Xi Jinping, right? The moment we are recording this podcast. Because Putin would like to know what Xi Jinping was thinking about China and US partnership, and on which stance this partnership going to go. So as we speak, everything is developing. But yes, I do agree with you. Whatever call we the table, but it's going to be presented by the presidents and at the high level for sure. At some point, I'm not sure when it's going to happen.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe and listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. The link is in the episode description. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.